Okay, welcome to the last two talks on the main program in the green room, starting with what I think is going to be a very important and interesting subject, ethics in Infosec, by Ivan Kwiatkowski from Kaspersky.
Hi, thanks a lot. So, dear colleagues, it's with great shame actually that I come to you today with a non-technical talk. But it is a subject that I've been meaning to talk about for a while now, and actually I'm very grateful to the Virus Bulletin board for giving me this opportunity. Ironically, it kind of means that the fact that this talk was accepted at a Defenders conference means that it's going to reach the people that need it the least, but let's have the talk nonetheless, right? So, I don't think anybody here needs to be reminded that cybersecurity is important, that technology shapes the way society shapes society, or that it has a profound impact on our lives. However, in my 10 years in the industry now, I have on multiple occasions met people who viewed themselves as morally agnostic problem solvers, or also suppliers of politically neutral code or information that will somehow make the world a better place. And the truth is, I don't think that to be the case. So, a good indication that this is, I think, a very much needed discussion is that it doesn't appear to have a lot of interest in the field. So, when was the last time that you saw an ethics conference at a cybersecurity conference, let alone an ethics track? What about the fact that our Infosec lingo only has terms like black hat and white hat, only manicured terms or simplistic terms like this? I mean, isn't it a way to kind of limit our way of thinking about things? Finally, what does it say about us that our leading ethical hacking certification doesn't even have a single question about ethics inside of it? And I think a while ago, Google published some research about a few 0 days that were being used by a Chinese-speaking actor to monitor a specific ethnic group. And there was one thing I couldn't help but wonder. What about the person who discovered those bugs? How did that person feel? Were they proud that thanks to their efforts, some very legitimate intelligence operation allowed them to get some valuable intelligence on some very legitimate targets? Or maybe these people were uncomfortable but still clinging to the belief that the end justified the means. Also, or was it people that were watching the news in disbelief, suddenly figuring out that their research had been misused dramatically? Did they cry themselves to sleep holding big bags of exploit brokering cash? Who knows? What about the people who set up the watering holes? How are they feeling right now? And I have to wonder about these things. And this talk is directed at this very specific category of people that may be about to do something terrible, but haven't stopped to think about it yet, in the sense that maybe they're blinded by either exhilarating technical challenges that are set in front of them, or maybe they were led to believe that their work had no moral implications. And I doubt any such people are here in this room today, but my hope is that someday some kid watches this talk on YouTube and doesn't do something he shouldn't be doing. So the first question we should be asking ourselves is, how did we get here? So there are a few responses, I think. The first one is that the cybersecurity field is a little young, and we may not have had the time to have some introspection. But this is not a reason that can stand on its own, I believe, because, well, there are other fields in cybersecurity, in the IT field that are very acutely aware of the moral implications of their work. So if you speak with anyone who works in the AI field, I mean, they know what they're doing and they know it's important. Another thing is that the field lacks diversity. It's not just an issue about gender gap, because, I mean, women can also have an ethical behavior too. But the thing is, having people in the community that all have the same background and all have the same education is, of course, going to lead to people making the same decisions. And it's a bit of a problem when we need to have more advanced reflections. And finally, I think the point that stands out the most is the fact that in the field we tend to focus a lot on technical education. So curriculums tend to focus on technical subjects and are in fact comprised of mostly of them. And I don't think the education that we receive provides us with sufficient skills or sufficient background in philosophy, for instance. And as such, practitioners in the field may only rely on their personal intuitions to tackle the moral issues that they are going to face, instead of being able to benefit from the combined works of generations of thinkers. So a good example of this is that in other venues, this slide would have gotten a lot more laughs. So, as such, this is a very modest talk. It has a very limited scope, and the reason for this is nobody wants a French guy to tell them right from wrong, right? So this is not what I'm going to do. I'm not here to offer a grand unified theory of just the theory of justice applied to Infosec. No, what I want to do is just acknowledge the moral dilemmas that we have to face in the field, and also present some existing ethical frameworks that could maybe provide answers to some people, though not, of course, not definitive answers. So let's start with the basic fact, which is that, of course, knowledge is power. If you control what people know about something, then you can influence how they're going to act. So, for instance, if you convince the world that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, then maybe they're going to let you invade it. And Infosec is in the business of controlling who has access to what information. And as such, it follows very directly that cybersecurity deals with power. And it turns out that a lot of people are interested in power. And virtually every nation in the world has identified cybersecurity as a very strategic field. And they have identified as well how cybersecurity transforms the operation of the state. So SIGINT has dramatically changed the way intelligence is collected. Cyber sabotage and also disinformation campaigns have started, I think, changing the way wars are waged. But also on a smaller scale, even companies and individuals are liable to handle information or software that may purposefully or otherwise have an important repercussion on the rest of the world. What could happen? So there could be harm to privacy, so your personal data may be leaking online. Your property may be damaged in the sense that it has happened in the past that people's money was stolen by hackers. And in the worst case scenario, even people can be killed, you know. It's been rumored that Jamal Khashoggi's communications had been monitored with the Pegasus malware before he was assassinated. So, the real harm can be done here. So let's focus on maybe 3 ethical dilemmas that we may be facing at some point in our InfoSec lives, and try to figure out if we can see if there are some answers for them in the literature, although not ours. So the first one would be the legitimate hacking problem, which is that intelligence agencies and armies will justify that hacking operations are justified because of the reason of the state. They'll tell you that cyber capabilities are a weapon, and they are required to use it to protect the interests of the nation. Some countries have also set up a very pervasive surveillance apparatus that supposedly is invaluable in preventing terrorism. Companies may also be tempted to resort to legitimate hacking in the form of the hackback. If they feel like they've been hacked by someone, they might want to apply some counter-strike. And finally, some individuals claiming the title of hacktivists may feel like for a perceived greater good, then they might be justified in hacking something or someone. Another dilemma that we do have to face from time to time is what happens when we find a vulnerability. As far as I know, the InfoSec community still has to reach an agreement on the correct way to handle such vulnerabilities when they are discovered. Finally, there are a number of companies that specialize in selling software or hacking tools, and their business consists in developing commercial-grade malware or high-impact exploits, and then they will sell them to their customers. And the few companies that will publicly speak about what they're doing will swear that they will only do business with governments that are democratically elected and that have a good track record of protecting human rights, but in practice, there have been documented cases where such companies have made suspect decisions in that regard. So when we try to discuss these issues inside the InfoSec community, then sometimes we are met with blanket objections. So people saying that all they do is legal or that they are just doing their job. So these are excerpts from an article from Reuters on Project Raven. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this here. And one thing I want to stress is that I do not want to make any judgments on any person who were at the origin of these judgments. I mean, people are complex and they definitely shouldn't be reduced to a statement or a mistake they may or may not have done in their lives. And instead, I think it is interesting to look at what they're saying and how they're thinking or what they were thinking at the moment where something a bit difficult might have happened. So the idea that the reason why we have different words for morality and legality is very simple. It's because they are different concepts. For instance, if you take any authoritarian country in the world, then whatever happens over there is perfectly legal. It doesn't mean it's moral. And it was the other way around too, in the sense that whatever is moral isn't always legal. So if you look at same-sex debates that are occurring currently all over the world, then you'll see that a lot of people feel that same-sex people should be allowed to marry together, but it's not legal everywhere. So the fact that people are doing something legal doesn't imply that whatever they're doing is moral. And here in this tweet above, this person, who is of course entitled to their opinion, says that exploits that are being sold on the offense market are being used legally. But actually, the good question would be, are they used morally? And that thread goes on to imply that concepts of right and wrong do not actually really exist, right? There are only people making choices in situations for which there aren't really right or wrong answers. And such people would be perfectly legitimate to tell me that, well, I just talked about same-sex marriage, and 50 years ago, I mean, this was completely out of the question. So doesn't it show that morality evolves over time? And as such, isn't morality so deeply rooted inside our cultures that any attempts to define it are inherently pointless? Well, another critic might be that, generations of philosophers have been working on those issues for thousands of years. Who are we to think that as the IT community we are going to be able to solve these issues? I would retort that while it is true that all cultures might have different views on what morals are, all of them do have a moral code indeed. And it shows to me that maybe those questions are unsolvable, but they are also inescapable. So these blanket objections out of the way, I think it's worth taking some time to reflect on the way Infosec practitioners are led to engage in unethical behavior. I think it's probably safe to assume that most people in this room would not accept an outright unethical job. So if I were to ask one of you to hack a journalist for me, for instance, then you would say no, of course. But from that standpoint, I think it would be very easy to condemn the very educated people that have actually been caught in the cookie jar engaging in what looks like unethical behavior. I think it's perhaps more helpful to think about the possible ways that our Infosec ecosystem might tend to encourage bad decisions, or at least creates conditions in which these bad decisions might happen. Intelligence agencies who specialize in making people do what they don't want to do have a very well-known persuasion framework that they call MICE. And this acronym stands for money, ideology, compromise, and ego. So if I ask you to hack a journalist and you say no, if I offer you $1 million to do it, maybe you'll think about it. The big appeal to exploit brokers is that they offer giant payouts for premium bugs. Another way I could maybe get you to do what I want, like if I tell you that the journalist I want you to hack is he works for foreign power or he may be a terrorist undercover, then these might look like actual good reasons to do something that at first appears unethical. Ego also, which actually I believe our community is quite susceptible to, consists in driving someone through flattery. So the idea here would be to offer someone some extremely complex technical challenges like organizing mass surveillance, or offer someone to operate in a very elite or prestigious agency where they would be basically above the law. It's worth pointing out that ego doesn't have to be manipulated by third parties to lead to questionable behavior, and there have been various examples of people disclosing information or tools on the internet just for social media credit. And finally, the last case, the most extreme one, would be the case of compromise, where if you don't want to hack that journalist for me, then I will punch you in the face and make you work in salt mines for the rest of your life. There was a Bloomberg article a few years ago, I think now, about the conditions of duress under which North Korean hackers were made to hunt money for their government. But of course, we're talking about here very extreme cases, and they will likely never be applied to any of us here in the room. However, compromise can also work in subtler ways. So for instance, opaque structures like the one presented in the Reuters articles for Project Raven, or one could assume intelligence agencies are going to withhold critical information from their employees through a compartmentalization. And this will ensure that their employees they may not be able to apprehend the objectionable objectives that they are contributing to. A more subtle form of compromise will also to threaten to expose someone's participation to a project after they have been gradually, after the extent of the unethical behavior they've been participating in, unbeknownst to them, is being gradually revealed to them. So then those people might argue that the Rubicon has already been crossed and that there's nothing to do anymore. If you think back to Edward Snowden, think about how many colleagues did he have? Thousands, maybe? So to think, you have to imagine the kind of precious systems that have to be in place to keep so many people in check for such a long time. So since cybersecurity deals with power and we as practitioners are kind of wielders of this power, then I think we should not only be wary about ourselves, but also wary about the people, the numerous people who might wish to acquire this power for their own agenda. And this presentation definitely doesn't make a point that government work, or any work for that matter, is inherently unethical. It does, however, make the point that we owe it to ourselves to be familiar with manipulation techniques that could be used against us. And also, we owe it to ourselves to have a clear idea of what constitutes ethical behavior and what doesn't. And for this, well, we turn to philosophy. The vision of what constitutes ethical practice doesn't have to be reimagined from scratch, of course. In this last part of the presentation, what I would like to do is to present, to introduce a few of the major theories from the philosophy of justice and try to see how they could be applied to the dilemmas that I presented earlier. So a common thought experiment that's being used in philosophy is the trolley experiment. The idea here is very simple. Imagine that you're sitting next to tracks and there is a runway trolley car that's speeding at a few people that are stuck on the tracks, like maybe 5 people. You're on the side and you have a lever next to you, and if you pull that lever, then the trolley car is going to be diverted and only a single person is going to be killed. So what would be the right thing to do here? And I think most people in the room would agree that it would be right to pull the lever. But the better question is, why would it be right? Surely it's better than a single person is killed instead of 5, right? So that would be utilitarianism. The idea here is intuitively appealing. It's that all creatures feel pleasure and pain, and we all try to maximize our pleasure and minimize our pain. And so the right thing to do it would be to act in a way that maximizes utility for everyone. And utility here means maximizing the good for the greatest number. So utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory in the sense that it places the moral worth of an action in the consequences of that action. So if you do something and it turns out that a very good thing happened for everyone, then it was a good act. Of course, utilitarianism has a lot of critics, which is that it can promote sacrificing the few for the good of the many. It doesn't really recognize fundamental rights. And an example of this is that if you arrest a terrorist and he knows where a bomb is located, and if this bomb is going to kill 1,000 people, then you might feel like it's okay to torture that person to have him tell you where the bomb is. And the reason for this is, well, what is the suffering of one single person against the survival of 1,000? But utilitarianist theory also dictates that it would kind of be okay to torture that person's daughter or little sister as long as it provides reliable intelligence, which is a bit more questionable and a bit more difficult to resolve. So if we try to apply the utilitarianism doctrine to vulnerability handling, then I think it does a good job of illustrating the very speculative nature of consequentialist reasoning. It's very unclear how getting a vulnerability patched would exactly affect the global utility. I mean, we know the global utility is going to decrease because no matter what you do, people are going to be unhappy. But what is the decision that would make the less people less unhappy? So sadly, I really do not have the time to go over all the possible options here, but I can do a quick recap. So if you sell your 0 day to a broker, then okay, you're happy because you get money, which is good, right? But a lot of people are going to be exploited because of that, and it's virtually impossible to know who is going to be affected by it and how. If you do irresponsible disclosure, then you are going to get a lot of retweets. But again, a lot of people are going to be exploited in a way that you definitely cannot control. Also, some pro coder is going to have to work on a Friday night to write a patch, which is not nice. When it comes to responsible disclosure, the vulnerability that you report may or may not be patched, and you get a T-shirt. But what about the people who don't update their software? If they get exploited afterwards, is that on you? Is that your responsibility? I mean, because they might not have been exploited if you had just said nothing. And this is the last option. If If you do nothing, well, you're sad that all your work is going to waste, but at the same time, well, nobody gets exploited. But also nobody learns from your research, and maybe someone finds the bug later. But from a utilitarian perspective, doing nothing appears to be the right thing to do in most cases. So please look at the article in the proceedings for a more detailed analysis. But if you believe that people have unalienable fundamental rights that are intrinsic, as opposed to rights that would be granted to them because those rights benefit society as a whole, then you may not be very satisfied with the utilitarian account. And then you can turn to another philosopher who's a renowned philosopher called Immanuel Kant, and he observes that human beings are gifted with free will. And freedom for him means that we can act and obey to laws that we have set for ourselves. And then morality resides solely in our personal decision to follow these laws for good. So, contrary to utilitarianism, this theory has really no interest in the consequences of actions. I mean, it is categorical in that sense. Actions are moral in themselves, and it doesn't matter whether they succeed or not. I mean, if you do the right thing and thousands of people end up getting killed, I mean, that's too bad, right? But at least you did the right thing, and this is what matters in this theory. So the moral worth is also placed in the intent. So if we have to act according to laws that we set for ourselves, then what should they be? I mean, isn't it kind of subjective? And Kant says, no, it's not. He says that there is a categorical imperative that is dictated by pure practical reasoning, and for which he offers a number of formulations, one of which is presented here. So I know I'm going to get killed for simplifying things like this, but basically Kant is saying, renowned philosopher Kant is saying, don't be a dick. He's saying, you should not lie to people, you should not murder people, you should not restrict their freedom, and basically, you should always treat people with respect and respect them as human beings. And no matter what the situation, you should always do this. This is what he believes. So, if we go back to the legitimate hacking dilemma, then many countries have published, will willfully admit that they put some people under surveillance. They say that, okay, there are some people who are suspected of terrorism, and yeah, we do monitor them, we do want to know what they're doing. And whether or not this ends up saving lives would make absolutely no difference to a categorical thinker. They would argue that violating an individual's privacy would, for any perceived gain, actually would be to use a person as a means instead of using them as an end. And so, failing to respect someone's dignity, or even the terrorist's dignity, by treating them as a mere way of producing an effect, no matter what desirable effect, by the way, constitutes a lapse in judgment. And so hacking back would likely be rejected on the same grounds. It's neither doing the right thing nor for the right reasons. So moving on. While we are all bound by the laws of our countries, I mean, we have never explicitly agreed to them in the first place, right? Newborns don't get to agree to terms of services. So there is a modern American philosopher called John Rawls, who I think is doing some very interesting work. Well, he did, because he's dead now, but he did a very interesting research on how to bridge this gap between laws and morality. And he focuses on the idea of a social contract, and he points out that he studies the conditions under which a social contract can have any moral worth. And his idea is the following. He says that if we were to close the doors of this very room here and we were to try to agree on what justice is, then it would likely be very difficult. I think none of us would get to go home because we would not be able to find an agreement. He also says that even if we did find an agreement, then it's very likely that disparities between knowledge and power amongst us would likely skew the resulting agreement in the favor of a select elite. So, to ensure that the resulting contract would be fair, he devised a very interesting thought experiment, I think, which is called the veil of ignorance. What it does is it assumes a position of equality between all participants. And he says, what if people were placed behind a veil of ignorance where they know nothing about the rest of the world, and also they know nothing about themselves. They don't know if they're going to be someone smart or stupid. They don't know if they're going to be black or white. They don't know if they're going to be rich or poor. They know nothing. And he says that if people were to agree on terms without this knowledge of who they're going to be, then the terms that they would agree to would be fair indeed. So here, applied to the trolley card problem, imagine that we take 10 people in this room and we have to make a decision about what we are going to do with that lever, and then we're going to draw straws, and depending on the straws you draw, you're going to end up in one of these positions. So you may be the guy with the lever, which is a good position, but you may also be the guy on one of the 5 guys on the tracks. And so Rawls argues that in these conditions, then there would only be two principles that would emerge in such a situation. He says that all citizens should have equal rights, such as freedom of speech, opinion, liberty, etc. And he also says that any equalities in society can be tolerated, but only as long as they benefit the least well-off. So if we look behind the veil at the problem of dual-use software, let's think about how we would feel about the distribution of dual-use technology. How would we feel about the idea that some corporations are selling surveillance software to governments, to foreign governments? Seeing how whole populations seem to be targeted these days, I think even the most risk-seeking gamblers in this room would agree that more often than not, they would find themselves on the wrong end of an exploit. So, by the way, I mentioned that in this framework, injustices that benefit the least well-off are acceptable, but it seems clear that surveillance capabilities overwhelmingly favor the people who are already holding a position of power. So the injustice that they cause, like violation of privacy, chilling effects on free speech, people getting killed, would definitely not be tolerable. So yeah, I think this veil of ignorance thought process or thought experiment is actually a great tool to figure out whether or not something is moral or whether it's not. So in this presentation, I introduced really a few moral frameworks in the hope that interested readers are going to try and find out more about them. It's definitely not meant as a formal or comprehensive account on any of them. It does not prioritize them in any way either. So what more can we do beyond this? I think it would behoove our community to allocate more attention to this very subject of ethics. Physicians, for instance, also wield a very big position of power in our society, and they have devised the Hippocratic Oath, which serves as a reminder of how to responsibly use this power that they have received. Maybe it is time that our profession starts adopting a global code of conduct as well. Maybe established and respected organizations like the EFF could play a role in pushing those standards. On another note, conference organizers, they do have the power to guide the discourse inside the Infosec community. In particular, I think it may not be beneficial anymore to reserve keynote slots to celebrities from the field, especially those celebrities whose success in some cases might be traced back to either ruthless business tactics or maybe suspicious behavior. So instead, I think conference organizers have this big opportunity to correct our field's lack of diversity, not only by inviting people from underprivileged minorities, but also by inviting people from other fields. What I would love to see is philosophers coming to the stand and tell us what they think about us. I would love to see victims of cyber abuse recount their stories and let us know what our shortcomings are and help us to find ways that we could together become the change that we'd like to see in the world. So thank you very much for your attention.